The map spread across the makeshift table was unlike anything the men of Delta, Colorado had ever seen, drawn in a woman's precise hand with measurements and notations that would shame a surveyor trained back east. Josephine Bryant stood at the edge of the Rocky Mountain Cartographic Society's dusty meeting hall in June of 1878, watching through the window as bearded men twice her age shuffled past her work without a second glance, their boots heavy with dismissal and something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. She had spent 3 months charting the unmarked territory between Delta and the Utah border, sleeping in a canvas tent with her Winchester across her lap, taking astronomical readings by starlight, and filling notebook after notebook with calculations that proved what the old-timers insisted was impossible. There was a passable route through the Red Rock Canyons, one that could cut 2 weeks off the cattle drive to the railhead in Grand Junction. She had the proof right there in ink and careful measurements, and not a single rancher would look her in the eye long enough to hear her explain it. Miss Bryant, the society president, a portly man named Henderson with tobacco stains in his beard, cleared his throat. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, but map-making is dangerous work. Perhaps you might consider more suitable pursuits for a young lady." Josephine felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest. At 23, she had studied under her father, who had mapped half of Kansas before consumption took him 2 years back. She had learned to read the land the way other women read scripture, to see in the curves of a canyon wall the story of water and time. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and her father had raised her with a compass in one hand and a sextant in the other. Never once suggesting her gender made her less capable of understanding the mathematics of longitude and latitude. "Mr. Henderson, if you would simply examine the topographical notations on the western quadrant, you would see that I have accounted for the seasonal water flow and identified 3 natural springs that would make the route viable even in August." She kept her voice level, professional, though she wanted to grab the man by his collar and force him to see what was right in front of his face. Henderson did not even glance at the map. "I am sure it is very pretty, Miss Bryant. Perhaps you could sell it as decoration." She rolled up the map with hands that trembled only slightly, securing it with a leather cord her father had tooled himself. The meeting hall emptied around her, men filing out into the bright Colorado sunshine, their voices carrying back through the open door in fragments about cattle prices and the damned Ute Indians making trouble up north. None of them spoke about her map, about the work that had left her hands scarred and her face sun darkened to a shade no respectable woman would tolerate. Josephine walked back to the boarding house where she rented a small room, the map tube bumping against her leg with each step. Delta was not a large town, just a scattering of buildings where the Gunnison River cut through the valley, but it sat at the edge of wild country, and that had drawn her here. The West was still being defined, still being measured and named, and she had believed there might be room in all that vastness for a woman who could read the stars and translate them into coordinates. The boarding house sat on the edge of town, a 2-story structure that had seen better days. Mrs. Kowalski, who ran the place, was kneading bread in the kitchen when Josephine entered through the back door. The older woman looked up, flour dusting her thick forearms, and her expression softened with sympathy. "They did not listen," she said. "It was not a question. They did not even look." Josephine set the map tube on the kitchen table and accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Kowalski poured without asking. "I could have drawn them a treasure map to El Dorado and received the same response. Men are fools." Mrs. Kowalski punched down her bread dough with unnecessary force. "My husband, God rest him, he would not ask for directions if he was lost in his own barn. You think these cowboys are any different?" Josephine sipped the bitter coffee and stared out the window at the mountains rising in the distance, purple and gray against the summer sky. Somewhere out there in that unmapped territory was everything she had worked for, every measurement and carefully drawn contour line proving that she could do this work as well as any man. Better than most, if she was being honest. But proof meant nothing if no one would look at it. "I could take it to Grand Junction," she said, thinking out loud. "The territorial surveyor's office might be more receptive. That is 3 days' ride." Mrs. Kowalski shaped her dough into loaves with practiced efficiency. "And you would need an escort. A woman traveling alone, it is not safe." Josephine had traveled alone for 3 months mapping the canyon country, but she did not argue. Mrs. Kowalski worried the way some people breathed, constant and necessary. Instead, she finished her coffee and carried the map tube upstairs to her room, where afternoon light slanted through the single window and illuminated the other maps pinned to her walls. Kansas, Nebraska, the eastern half of Colorado Territory, all drawn in her father's firm hand. She had kept them when she sold everything else, unable to let go of the physical proof that he had existed, that his work had mattered. She was pinning her new map beside his when she heard boots on the stairs, heavier than Mrs. Kowalski's tread. A knock followed, 2 sharp raps. "Miss Bryant." "Package came for you on the afternoon stage." Josephine opened the door to find Mrs. Kowalski's son, a gangly youth of 16, holding a wrapped parcel. She took it with thanks and shut the door, examining the package with curiosity. She was not expecting anything, had no one left who might send her parcels. The return address read simply, J. Harrison, Surveyor General's Office, Denver. Inside was a letter and a leather-bound journal, the pages blank and waiting. The letter was brief, written in a crumbling hand. "Miss Bryant, your father once did work for this office that proved invaluable during the establishment of property boundaries in Douglas County. I was sorry to hear of his passing. I understand you have continued his work. If the enclosed journal should happen to be filled with accurate surveys of previously unmapped territory, I would be very interested in seeing it. The government pays well for reliable information. J. Harrison." Josephine read the letter 3 times, her heart beating faster with each pass. Someone remembered her father. Someone knew she was doing this work. The journal in her hands represented possibility, official recognition, perhaps even payment that would let her continue mapping instead of taking in sewing or finding a husband who would expect her to forget she had ever learned to read a compass. She spent the evening transferring her canyon maps into the journal, copying each measurement with exacting care. The work soothed her, the familiar scratch of pen on paper, the satisfaction of seeing the blank pages fill with meaning. Outside her window, Delta settled into night, saloon music drifting on the breeze along with the lowing of cattle in the stockyard. This was the West she loved, raw and unfinished, full of spaces that needed names. The next morning she woke to the sound of horses in the street and men's voices raised in argument. Josephine dressed quickly and went to the window, peering down at the commotion. A group of ranchers had gathered outside the Delta Land Office, and from what she could hear, they were arguing about boundaries. Someone had filed a claim that overlapped with existing grazing rights, and without proper surveys, there was no way to prove who was in the right. She watched them gesture and shout, saw the frustration on weathered faces, and felt a grim satisfaction. They needed mapmakers, needed surveyors, needed people who could impose order on the chaos of overlapping claims and uncertain boundaries. They needed her, even if they would never admit it. Josephine was still at the window when she saw him ride into town. The cowboy sat his horse like he had been born in the saddle, moving with the animal instead of against it. He was young, probably close to her own age, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days of stubble shadowing his jaw. His clothes were trail-worn but well kept, and he had the lean, hard look of a man who worked for his living. He dismounted in front of the general store and tied his horse with quick, efficient movements, then paused to look around town as if getting his bearings. For a moment, just a moment, his gaze lifted to her window. Josephine stepped back instinctively, though she doubted he could see her clearly from that distance. Still, her pulse jumped in a way that annoyed her. She had not come to Delta to moon over cowboys, no matter how well they sat a horse. She forced herself away from the window and spent the morning working on her journal, adding notations about water sources and potential camping sites. Around noon, Mrs. Kowalski called her down for lunch, and Josephine descended to find the kitchen full of the smells of chicken and dumplings. "That cowboy who rode in this morning, he took a room," Mrs. Kowalski said, ladling stew into bowls. "Nathan Vance, he said his name was. From Texas originally, but he has been working ranches up and down the territory." Josephine made a non-committal sound and focused on her lunch. Mrs. Kowalski collected information the way some people collected stamps, cataloging the details of everyone who passed through her boarding house. "He asked about work," Mrs. Kowalski continued. "I told him the Thompson Ranch is hiring. They lost 2 men last month when that storm came through and spooked the herd." The door to the dining room opened, and the cowboy himself walked in. Up close, Josephine could see that his eyes were a startling gray-blue, the color of storm clouds over the mountains. He nodded politely to both of them and took a seat at the far end of the table, accepting the bowl Mrs. Kowalski offered with quiet thanks. "Mr. Vance, this is Miss Josephine Bryant," Mrs. Kowalski said, her matchmaking instincts clearly aroused. "She is a map maker." "A cartographer," Josephine corrected, though she immediately felt foolish for the distinction. Nathan Vance looked at her with genuine interest. "You make maps? Of what?" "The territory west of here. The canyon country near the Utah border." She waited for the dismissal, the polite but firm suggestion that such work was not appropriate. Instead, he said, "I ran cattle through there 2 years back. Nearly lost half the herd in a box canyon we did not see until we were committed. A good map would have saved us a lot of trouble." Josephine felt something loosen in her chest. "That is exactly what I have been trying to tell people. There are viable routes through that country, ways to avoid the dead ends and dry camps. But no one will listen." "May I see?" he asked it simply, as if requesting salt for his stew. She stared at him for a long moment, searching for mockery or condescension in his expression. She found only curiosity and what looked like genuine interest. Without allowing herself to overthink it, she stood and retrieved the journal from her room, bringing it down and opening it to her most recent work. Nathan Vance set down his spoon and studied the map with complete attention. His finger traced the route she had marked, pausing at her notations about water and shelter. He asked questions, good questions, about distances and terrain, about whether certain passes would be viable for cattle or just for a rider on horseback. Josephine answered, and as she did, she felt herself relaxing, falling into the familiar pleasure of discussing her work with someone who actually understood its value. "This is excellent," he said finally. "Detailed and practical. The ranchers around here would pay good money for information like this." I tried showing it to the Cartographic Society. They were not interested in work done by a woman. Nathan's expression darkened. "That is foolish. Good information is good information, regardless of who gathered it." He looked back at the map, his brow furrowed in thought. The Thompson Ranch is planning a big drive to Grand Junction in August. If I could show them this, prove there is a better route than the one they have been using, it would save them time and money. They would pay for that. Hope fluttered in Josephine's chest, fragile as a moth. You think they would listen to you? I think they would listen to anyone who could cut 2 weeks off a cattle drive. He met her eyes. Would you be willing to explain the route to the ranch owner? I could arrange an introduction. You would do that. Why would I not? This is good work. It deserves to be seen. Josephine realized she was gripping the edge of the table hard enough to hurt. She forced herself to release it, to breathe normally. Yes, yes, I would very much like that opportunity. Nathan smiled, and it transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made her pulse quicken. Then I will talk to Mr. Thompson this afternoon. I imagine he will want to meet with you tomorrow if that suits you. That would be perfect. Thank you, Mr. Vance. Nathan, he said. If we are going to be working together, we should probably use first names. Josephine. She felt herself smile back at him. Though most people call me Joe, Mrs. Kowalski had been watching this exchange with poorly concealed delight, and she bustled forward with more stew, insisting they both needed to eat properly before conducting any business. Josephine returned to her seat and her lunch, acutely aware of Nathan's presence at the other end of the table. They ate in companionable silence, and she found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he was not looking. He had the rough hands of a working man, scarred and calloused, but he held his spoon with an easy grace that suggested he had not always been a cowboy. There was something in the set of his shoulders, a kind of quiet confidence that made her want to know his story. Where he had come from, what had brought him to this dusty Colorado town, whether he planned to stay, or if he was just passing through like so many others who drifted west looking for something they could not name. After lunch, Nathan excused himself to ride out to the Thompson Ranch. Josephine returned to her room and tried to focus on her work, but she found herself distracted, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that would signal his return. She felt ridiculous, acting like a schoolgirl with a crush instead of a grown woman conducting business. But there was something about Nathan Vance that unsettled her carefully maintained composure, some quality in the way he had looked at her maps with respect instead of skepticism. He returned as the sun was starting to set, his horse lathered from a hard ride. Josephine was on the front porch, ostensibly enjoying the cooler evening air, though she had positioned herself where she would have a clear view of the street. Nathan dismounted and saw her immediately, his face breaking into a grin. "Mr. Thompson wants to meet you tomorrow at 10, he called up to her. He is very interested in what you have found. Josephine stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that wanted to tremble. Did you tell him I was a woman? Nathan climbed the porch steps. I told him you were the best damn mapmaker I had ever met, and that if he had any sense, he would listen to what you had to say. And he agreed to that. He trusts my judgment on cattle and trails. I gave him my word that your work was solid. Nathan's expression grew serious. I hope I did not overstep, but I have seen what you can do, Joe. Those maps are exactly what this territory needs. She realized he was standing very close, close enough that she could smell horse and leather and the clean sweat of honest work. Close enough to see the gold flecks in his gray-blue eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow that she had not noticed before. Close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body in the cooling evening air. You did not overstep, she said quietly. Thank you, Nathan, for believing in the work. For believing in you, he corrected, and then he stepped back, putting a careful distance between them. I should get my horse settled. It was a hard ride out and back. Josephine watched him lead his horse around to the small stable behind the boarding house, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. She had known this man for less than a day. It was absurd to feel this way, this pull of attraction and something deeper, something that felt dangerously like recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting for him without knowing it. That night, she lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to calm her racing thoughts. Tomorrow she would meet with Mr. Thompson, would try to convince a hard-bitten rancher that her maps were worth his money. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for, the validation she needed. She should be thinking about what to say, how to present her work in the most convincing light. Instead, she was thinking about the way Nathan had smiled at her, the casual certainty in his voice when he said he believed in her. No one had said that to her since her father died. She had been alone with her work and her determination, fighting for every inch of respect in a world that did not want to give it. And now here was this cowboy, this stranger, who looked at her maps and saw their value immediately. She must have eventually fallen asleep, because she woke to sunshine streaming through her window and the smell of Mrs. Kowalski's breakfast cooking downstairs. Josephine dressed with extra care, choosing her best traveling dress, a practical navy cotton that would not show dust. She pinned her dark hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck and studied herself in the small mirror above her washstand. She looked like what she was, a young woman trying to be taken seriously in a man's world. There was no hiding her gender, no disguising the curve of her cheekbones or the way her dress outlined her figure. She could only be herself and hope that would be enough. Nathan was waiting in the kitchen when she came down, dressed in clean clothes and freshly shaved. He stood when she entered, and she saw approval in his eyes as he took in her appearance. "You look very professional," he said. "I look like a woman pretending to be a cartographer," she replied, more sharply than she intended. "You look like exactly what you are. Someone who knows her business and is not afraid to prove it." He offered his arm. "My horse can carry us both out to the ranch if you do not mind riding double." Josephine hesitated only a moment before taking his arm. She had ridden double before, out of necessity on her surveying trips when her pack horse had gone lame. But this felt different, more intimate somehow. She collected her journal and the map tube, then allowed Nathan to help her onto his horse, settling sideways behind the saddle. He swung up in front of her with easy grace, and she had to put her arms around his waist to keep her balance. "Hold tight," he said, and she felt the words rumble through his chest where she pressed against his back. The ride to the Thompson ranch took just over an hour. Nathan kept the horse to a steady walk, mindful of his double burden, and Josephine tried not to think about how aware she was of every point of contact between them. The warmth of his body against hers, the flex of his muscles as he guided the horse, the smell of soap and clean linen that clung to his clothes. It was distracting in a way that made her angry at herself. She needed to focus on the upcoming meeting, not on the man who had arranged it. The Thompson ranch sprawled across a broad valley, with the main house and outbuildings clustered near a creek that ran year-round. Cattle dotted the hillsides, and Josephine could see cowboys working in the distance, small figures against the vastness of the landscape. Nathan rode straight to the main house and dismounted, then helped Josephine down with hands that lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist. Mr. Thompson himself came out to meet them, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a graying beard and eyes that had seen too much sun. He looked Josephine up and down with an expression she could not quite read, then turned to Nathan. "This is your map maker. This is Miss Josephine Bryant, the finest cartographer in Colorado Territory." Nathan's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "Joe, this is Amos Thompson." Josephine stepped forward and offered her hand like a man would. Thompson looked startled but took it, his grip careful, as if she might break. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. I believe I have information that could significantly benefit your upcoming cattle drive. Well, let us see what you have got." Thompson led them into the house, to a large room that clearly served as his office. Maps covered one wall, most of them crude sketches that showed landmarks but little detail. Josephine spread her map across his desk and stepped back, letting the work speak for itself. Thompson studied it in silence, his weathered fingers tracing the route she had marked. Nathan stood beside her, a solid presence that gave her courage. Finally, Thompson looked up. "You drew this yourself?" "Yes, sir. I spent 3 months surveying that territory, taking measurements and making observations. Every notation on that map is based on direct observation." "And you are saying this route here, through Doming's Canyon, is passable for cattle?" "Not only passable but preferable to the standard route through the high country. It cuts nearly 2 weeks off the journey to Grand Junction, and there are reliable water sources every 10 to 15 miles. I have marked them all." Josephine pointed to her annotations. "The canyon floor is wide enough for a herd, and there is good grazing along the river." Thompson was silent for a long moment, studying the map with an intensity that made Josephine's palms sweat. Finally, he said, "My foreman rode that country 5 years back. He said it was a death trap." "With respect, Mr. Thompson, if your foreman went in without accurate information about the terrain, he likely made the wrong turns. There are several box canyons that look like they might lead through, but only one true passage. I have marked it clearly. And if you are wrong, if I take 500 head of cattle into that canyon and find there is no way through," Josephine met his eyes steadily, "then I will refund whatever you pay me and work for your ranch for free until I have made up the loss. I am that confident in my work." Nathan made a small sound beside her, surprise or possibly approval. Thompson's eyebrows rose. "That is a bold promise, Miss Bryant." "I do not make promises I cannot keep." Thompson looked back at the map, then at Nathan. "You have seen this country. What do you think?" "I think Miss Bryant has done work that no one else has bothered to do properly," Nathan said. "I think we would be fools not to take advantage of it. And I think if you send scouts ahead to verify the route before committing the herd, you risk nothing and could gain weeks." Thompson drummed his fingers on the desk, thinking. Josephine held her breath, trying not to let hope overwhelm common sense. This was business, just business. If Thompson said no, she would find another buyer for her maps. "I will pay you $50 for this map and your notes," Thompson said finally. "And if the route proves as good as you claim, I will pay another $50 as a bonus. Fair?" $50 was more money than Josephine had seen in months. 100 would keep her supplied and working for most of a year. She wanted to shout her acceptance, to grab the man's hand and shake it before he could change his mind. Instead, she kept her voice level and professional. "That is very fair, Mr. Thompson. Thank you." They shook on it, and Thompson counted out $50 in gold coins, heavy and real in Josephine's palm. She made him a copy of the relevant section of her map right there at his desk, her hand steady despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. Thompson watched her work with something like respect growing in his expression. "You learned this from your father?" he asked. "Yes, sir. He was a surveyor in Kansas before the war. He taught you well." Thompson took the completed map and studied it again. "I may have more work for you if you are interested. Property boundaries, fence lines, that sort of thing. Pays nowhere near as well as route mapping, but it is steady." "I would be very interested in that, Mr. Thompson." They left the ranch an hour later, Josephine's pockets heavy with gold and her heart even lighter. Nathan helped her back onto his horse, and this time when she wrapped her arms around his waist, it felt natural, easy. They rode in silence for a while, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders and the mountains standing purple in the distance. "You were magnificent," Nathan said finally. "The way you stood up to him, the way you defended your work. I have never seen anything like it." "I was terrified," Josephine admitted. "I thought he was going to laugh at me." "He did not laugh. He listened, and he paid you, and he offered you more work. That is a victory, Joe." She rested her forehead against his shoulder for just a moment, allowing herself to feel the full weight of relief and triumph. "Thank you. I could not have done this without you. You could have. You would have found a way." He paused, then added quietly, "But I am glad I could help." They reached Delta as the sun was setting, the sky on fire with orange and red. Nathan helped Josephine down from the horse, his hands lingering at her waist, and she found herself not wanting to step away. They stood there in the dusty street, facing each other, and the air between them felt charged with possibility. "Will you have dinner with me?" Nathan asked. "To celebrate." Josephine knew she should say no, should maintain professional boundaries, should not let herself feel what she was feeling for this man she barely knew. But she was tired of should, tired of always choosing duty and propriety over what she wanted. "I would like that very much." They ate at the hotel restaurant, the nicest place in Delta, which was not saying much but still felt special. Nathan ordered steak and potatoes, and Josephine chose the roast chicken, and they talked while they waited for the food. Really talked, the kind of conversation that ranged from the profound to the silly, touching on everything from astronomy to favorite childhood memories. She learned that Nathan had been born in Texas, but lost his family to yellow fever when he was 15. He had worked his way north, ranch to ranch, learning cattle and horses and the 100 small skills that kept a man alive on the frontier. He had taught himself to read from a Bible he found in an abandoned claim shack, and he could quote long passages from memory in a voice that made the words sound like poetry. He learned that Josephine had never lived anywhere long enough to have childhood friends, that her father had been her whole world, and losing him had left her adrift in ways she was still discovering. She told him about the night she had decided to come to Colorado, how she had spread out her father's maps and closed her eyes and put her finger down at random, and it had landed on Delta. It had felt like a sign, though she was not usually superstitious. "Maybe it was," Nathan said. "Maybe you were supposed to end up here." "You believe in that? Fate, destiny, all of that?" He considered the question seriously, cutting his steak into precise pieces. "I believe some things are meant to happen. I believe some people are meant to find each other. Beyond that, I think we make our own fate through the choices we make every day." "And what made you choose Delta?" "The same thing that makes any cowboy choose any town. Work and wages," he smiled. "Though I am starting to think I might have had other reasons I did not know about yet." Josephine felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked down at her plate. The chicken was perfectly cooked, tender and savory, but she barely tasted it. She was too aware of Nathan across the table, of the way his eyes seemed to track her every movement, of the warmth in his voice when he said her name. After dinner, they walked back to the boarding house slowly, taking the long way around through the quiet streets. Delta was settling in for the night, lights glowing in windows and the sound of a piano drifting from the saloon. Josephine had walked these streets dozens of times, but tonight they felt different, charged with a magic she could not name. They reached the boarding house too soon. Nathan walked her to the porch, and they stood facing each other in the shadows, the night air cool against her flushed skin. "Thank you for dinner," Josephine said, "and for everything today. You changed my life, Nathan Vance. You changed your own life. I just opened a door." He reached out and took her hand, his rough palm warm against hers. Joe, I know we have only just met, and maybe this is too forward, but I need you to know. I would like to see more of you, get to know you better. If that is something you might want as well." Josephine's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. Every careful instinct she had cultivated, every wall she had built to protect herself, was screaming at her to be cautious. She ignored all of it. "I would want that," she said. "Very much." Nathan's smile was bright enough to light the darkness. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture that should have seemed old-fashioned but instead felt perfect, exactly right. "Then I will see you tomorrow, Miss Bryant." "Joe," she reminded him. "Just Joe. Tomorrow, Joe." She floated upstairs to her room, her hand tingling where he had kissed it. Mrs. Kowalski was pretending to dust the hallway and failed utterly to hide her knowing smile. Josephine did not care. Let the whole town know. Let them talk. She had sold her first map, secured the promise of more work, and met a man who looked at her like she was something rare and precious. That night she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, but this time her sleeplessness was happy, full of possibilities instead of frustrations. She replayed every moment of the day, every word Nathan had spoken, every look they had exchanged. She was falling, she knew, falling fast and hard for a cowboy with storm cloud eyes and hands that were gentle despite their calluses. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The next weeks passed in a blur of work and stolen moments with Nathan. Thompson's scouts verified her route, and the $50 bonus arrived with a note asking if she would be willing to map the ranch's northern boundary. She said yes, and spent 3 days riding the property line with Nathan as her escort, ostensibly for safety but really because neither of them could stand to be apart. They talked constantly, about everything and nothing. He told her stories about his years on the trail, about stampedes and rattlesnakes, and the night the entire herd got spooked by a meteor shower. She told him about her father, about growing up in survey camps, about the way she saw the land not as it was but as it could be translated into lines and symbols on paper. And sometimes they did not talk at all. Sometimes they just rode side by side, comfortable in the silence, watching the land unfold around them. Josephine had always been solitary by necessity and temperament, but with Nathan, silence felt like communion instead of isolation. He kissed her for the first time on a ridge overlooking the Gunnison River. They had stopped to let the horses drink, and she had been standing at the edge, looking out at the water cutting its path through red rock, when she felt him come up behind her. "Joe," he said, and there was a question in his voice in the way he said her name. She turned, and he was right there, close enough to touch. She saw her own want reflected in his eyes, and it gave her the courage to close the distance between them. The kiss started gentle, tentative, a question being asked and answered. Then his arms came around her and she pressed closer, and gentle became something deeper, something that made her forget where she was, forget everything except the taste of him and the solid warmth of his body against hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said. "I know it is too soon. I know we should take this slower, but I cannot pretend I do not feel it." Josephine's breath caught. She should be careful, should protect her heart, should remember that cowboys were wanderers by nature, and nothing in the West was permanent. But she was tired of being careful, tired of protecting herself from everything including joy. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. They stood there on the ridge, holding each other while the horses grazed and the river sang its eternal song below. Josephine felt something shift inside her, some last wall crumbling away. She had been so focused on proving herself, on being taken seriously as a cartographer, that she had forgotten she was allowed to want other things too. Love, partnership, a life that included more than just work. That evening they rode back to Delta holding hands, her fingers twined with his across the space between their horses. Mrs. Kowalski took one look at them and started humming the wedding march under her breath. Josephine blushed and Nathan laughed, and it felt like coming home. But the West had a way of reminding people that happiness was never guaranteed. 3 days later, a rider came into town on a lathered horse, shouting about trouble at the Thompson Ranch. Utes had come down from the north, angry about surveyors marking land they considered theirs, and there had been a confrontation. Men were hurt. Thompson was calling in everyone who could ride and shoot. Nathan was saddling his horse before the rider finished talking. Josephine caught his arm. "I am coming with you. No, this could turn into a fight. I need you safe. Those surveyors were probably using my maps. If people are hurt because of my work, I need to be there." She met his eyes steadily. "And I can shoot as well as any man. My father made sure of that." Nathan looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew her well enough by now to recognize futility when he saw it. "Stay close to me. Do exactly what I say. Promise me, Joe." "I promise." They rode hard for the Thompson Ranch, arriving just before sunset to find controlled chaos. The main house had been turned into a hospital, with wounded men laid out on every available surface. Thompson stood in the yard organizing groups of armed men, his face grim. Vance, good, and Miss Bryant. He looked surprised to see her but did not send her away. The surveyors went up into Ute territory without proper authorization. Chief Ouaray's men drove them back. 3 of my cowboys got caught in the middle trying to bring them in. "How bad?" Nathan asked. "2 will live. Martinez took an arrow in the shoulder and it is bad. Doc Miller is with him now." Thompson's jaw tightened. "I have sent word to the Indian agent, but he is 2 days away. I am trying to keep my men from doing something stupid in the meantime." Josephine felt sick. This was her fault, indirectly. If she had not mapped those routes, the surveyors would not have felt confident enough to push into disputed territory. "Let me talk to them, to Chief Ouaray's people." Both men stared at her. "Absolutely not," Nathan said. "Think about it. They are angry because white men keep coming onto their land, taking what they want without permission or respect. If I go to them, a woman, unarmed, and apologize for the intrusion, it might defuse the situation. Or you might get killed," Nathan said flatly. "She has a point," Thompson said slowly. "The Utes respect courage and they have different rules for women. They might listen where they would not listen to one of us." "No," Nathan's voice was hard. "I will not let her risk her life like that." Josephine turned to face him fully. "You do not get to let me do anything, Nathan. I'm not your property. This is my choice." They stared at each other and she saw fear and anger and love warring in his expression. Finally, he said, "If you go, I go with you. Non-negotiable." "The Utes will not hurt a woman," Thompson said. "But they might kill you on principle, Vance. Then I will die protecting the woman I love." Nathan's eyes never left Josephine's face. "But I will not let her go alone." In the end, they compromised. Josephine would ride toward the Ute camp under a white flag, and Nathan would follow at a distance, close enough to help if things went wrong but far enough back that he might not be seen as a threat. Thompson provided the white cloth, and Josephine tied it to a long stick, her hands steadier than she felt. The Ute camp was 5 miles north, in a canyon Thompson's scouts had located. Josephine rode slowly, the white flag held high, acutely aware of Nathan behind her and the very real possibility that she was about to make a fatal mistake. But she could not live with herself if she did not try to fix this, to prevent more violence born from her maps and white men's greed. She was halfway to the canyon when riders appeared on the ridge above her. 4 Ute warriors on painted horses, watching her with expressions that gave nothing away. Josephine stopped her horse and waited, the flag still raised, her heart pounding so hard she felt light-headed. One of the warriors rode down to her, an older man with gray threading through his long, dark hair. He stopped a few yards away and studied her with dark, intelligent eyes. "You are the map woman," he said in English, "the one who charts our land for the whites." Josephine was so surprised to hear him speak her language that it took her a moment to respond. "I am a cartographer, yes, and I have come to apologize. The surveyors should not have entered your territory without permission. That was wrong. They follow your lines. They think because a white woman draws the land on paper, it belongs to them. I know, and I am sorry. I never meant for my work to be used to take what is not given." She lowered the flag slightly, a gesture of respect. "I came to ask what I can do to make this right." The warrior was silent for a long moment. Behind her, Josephine could feel Nathan's tension, knew he was watching every movement, ready to ride to her defense. She willed him to stay back, to trust her to handle this. "My name is Sekono," the warrior said finally. "Chief Aure sent me to watch the white men at the ranch, to make sure they do not come seeking revenge for their wounded cowboys. They will not. Mr. Thompson is trying to keep the peace. He sent for the Indian agent. The agent is a fool who promises much and delivers nothing." Sekono's expression was bitter. "But you, map woman, you are different. You come alone with courage. Chief Aure would speak with you." Josephine's mouth went dry. "I would be honored to speak with him. The cowboy behind you must stay here." Of course he had known Nathan was there. Josephine turned in her saddle and saw Nathan had indeed followed, keeping his distance but clearly visible. She rode back to him, leaving Sekono waiting. "They want me to go to their camp, alone. Then I am coming too. Nathan, they will not hurt me, but they will see you as a threat." "I do not care." His jaw was set in that stubborn line she was learning to recognize. "I am not letting you ride into a Ute camp by yourself. You have to trust me, please." She reached out and touched his face, feeling the tension in his jaw. "I will be careful, but I need to do this. For everyone's sake." Nathan closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were filled with pain. "If anything happens to you, Joe, I will not survive it. Nothing is going to happen to me." She hoped she sounded more confident than she felt. "Wait here. I will be back before dark." She kissed him quickly, then rode back to Sekono before she could lose her nerve. The warrior nodded approval and turned his horse, leading her north into the canyon country. The other 3 warriors fell in around her, not threatening but clearly ensuring she could not change her mind and flee. The Ute camp was tucked into a box canyon with water and shelter, temporary but well organized. Women looked up from cooking fires as Josephine rode in, and children stopped their games to stare at the white woman with her strange clothes and nervous horse. Sekono led her to the largest dwelling, where an older man sat on a blanket, clearly waiting. Chief Aure was not as old as Josephine had expected, perhaps 50, with a face that spoke of both wisdom and weariness. He gestured for her to dismount and sit, which she did, grateful her legs still worked despite the fear singing through her veins. "You are the cartographer," Aure said. His English was flawless, better than many of the white men she had met. "The woman who makes maps." "Yes, sir." "Josephine Bryant. And you have come to apologize for the surveyors who mark my people's land as if it belongs to them." "I have come to apologize for my part in it. I drew the maps that gave them confidence to go where they should not have gone. That was not my intention, but intention does not erase consequence." Aure studied her for a long time. "You speak honestly. Most whites come to me with lies wrapped in sweet words, promises they have no power to keep. You admit your mistake. That is rare. I do not want my work to be used to hurt people or take what is not mine to give, but I do not know how to prevent it. Josephine met his eyes. The whites will keep coming. You know that. They will map this land with or without me. At least my maps are accurate. At least I can try to mark clearly what is sacred land, what should not be disturbed. And if the whites ignore your marks, then I will have failed, but I will have tried. She took a deep breath. Chief Aure, I cannot stop what is coming. No one can. But maybe if I map carefully, if I mark the places that matter to your people, I can slow it down. Give you time to negotiate to protect what is most important. Aure was silent, his expression unreadable. Around them, the camp had gone quiet, people listening even if they could not understand the English words. Finally, the chief said, "You are either very brave or very foolish, Josephine Bryant. Probably both." A smile flickered across his face there and gone. "I will consider your offer. But understand this. If I agree to show you the sacred places, the places that must not be touched, you will be responsible for protecting them. If whites come to those places with your maps in their hands, I will hold you accountable." The weight of that responsibility settled onto Josephine's shoulders like a physical thing, but she did not flinch from it. "I understand, and I give you my word I will do everything in my power to protect what you show me." Aure nodded slowly. "Then we will speak more of this, but not today. Today, you will share a meal with us, and we will learn if you are as honest as you seem." Josephine stayed in the Ute camp until sunset, eating stew made from rabbit and wild onions, answering questions about her work and her life with an honesty that seemed to surprise and please her hosts. She learned that Aure had been educated by whites, that he spoke 4 languages, that he was fighting a losing battle to keep his people's way of life alive in the face of unstoppable Western expansion. She saw the sadness in his eyes when he spoke of the future, and she understood that he knew what was coming, knew that no amount of negotiation or maps or good intentions would stop the flood of white settlement. But he was trying anyway, fighting for every acre, every sacred site, every small victory that might let his people survive a little longer. Josephine respected that, respected him, and when she finally took her leave as the sun touched the horizon, she felt like she had made not just an ally but a friend. Sakono escorted her back to where Nathan waited, and she saw the relief flood through him when he spotted her. He had not moved from where she left him, had spent the entire afternoon in an agony of waiting, and when she rode up, he pulled her from her horse into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Do not ever do that to me again," he said into her hair. "I thought I would lose my mind. I am safe. It was the right thing to do." She pulled back enough to see his face. "Chief Aure is going to work with me. He will show me the sacred sites, and I will mark them on my maps as places that cannot be surveyed or claimed. It is not much, but it is something." Nathan searched her face, then nodded. "You are an extraordinary woman, Josephine Bryant. I do not know how I got lucky enough to find you, but I thank God every day that I did." They rode back to the Thompson ranch together, and Josephine reported to Thompson what had been agreed. The rancher looked relieved and impressed in equal measure. "You may have just prevented a war, Miss Bryant," he said. "The territorial governor will want to hear about this." But Josephine was too tired to think about governors or politics. She let Nathan take her back to Delta, dozed against his back as the horse walked through the darkness, and when they reached the boarding house, she barely had the energy to climb the stairs to her room. She slept for 12 hours straight and woke to find a note slipped under her door. Nathan's handwriting neat and careful. "When you are ready, I will be waiting. Always. N." Over the following weeks, Josephine divided her time between commercial mapping work for Thompson and other ranchers, and the more delicate work of mapping sacred sites with Chief Awaray's guidance. Sakono became her regular escort on trips into Ute territory, and she learned from him the stories attached to various landmarks, the reasons certain springs and groves and cliff faces mattered. She recorded all of it carefully, knowing that someday these stories might be all that remained of a people being systematically pushed off their land. Nathan rode with her when he could, learning alongside her, his respect for the Utes growing with each trip. He had worked cattle in Texas alongside Comanche and Apache, had learned early that the people whites called savages were often more civilized than the settlers who displaced them. Together, he and Josephine formed a partnership that felt bigger than either of them alone, a small act of resistance against the tide of history. And in the evenings when the work was done, they would sit on the porch of the boarding house and talk about the future. Nathan had saved enough money to buy a small piece of land, nothing fancy but enough for a house and a corral and maybe a few cattle. Josephine had her mapping work, which was growing steadily as word spread of her skill and reliability. They could build a life here in Delta if they wanted it. "Marry me," Nathan said one night, not as a question but as a simple statement of fact, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Josephine had been expecting the question, had known it was coming, but hearing it still made her heart stumble. "Yes," she said, equally simply. "Of course, yes." They were married a month later, in October of 1878, in a simple ceremony at the Delta Church with Mrs. Kowalski as witness, and half the town in attendance. Josephine wore a dress she sewed herself, pale blue cotton with lace at the collar, and Nathan wore his best clothes and a look of such complete joy that it made her throat tight. They spoke their vows in voices that did not waver, promising love and fidelity and partnership, and when the preacher said Nathan could kiss his bride, he did so with a tenderness that brought tears to Mrs. Kowalski's eyes. The town threw them a party at the hotel, with food and music and dancing that lasted until midnight. Josephine danced with Nathan until her feet hurt, then danced some more, unwilling to let go of this perfect happiness. When they finally slipped away to the small house Nathan had built on his land, she felt drunk on joy and possibility. Their wedding night was tender and passionate by turns, a discovery of each other that felt both new and deeply familiar. Nathan touched her like she was precious, like he had been given something rare and wanted to cherish every moment. Josephine gave herself to him without reservation, without the fear that had shadowed so much of her life, and in the giving, found a freedom she had not known existed. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Nathan's hand tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder while she listened to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she said into the darkness. "I did not think I would ever find this, someone who saw me as I am and loved me anyway." "Not anyway," Nathan corrected gently, "because of who you are, every stubborn, brilliant, brave part of you." He kissed the top of her head. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Joe Vance." Joe Vance. She tested the name silently, feeling how it fit. She had been Josephine Bryant for 23 years, had worn that name through grief and loneliness and hard-won success. But she did not mind setting it aside for this new identity, this partnership that felt like becoming more herself instead of less. They settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Nathan continued working for Thompson while building up his own small herd, and Josephine took on more and more mapping work, including a commission from the territorial government to survey potential railroad routes. The money was good, enough that they could afford small luxuries like books and better tools, and the piano Nathan bought her for their first Christmas together. because he remembered her mentioning once that she had loved music as a child. Chief Aure visited them occasionally, usually unannounced, riding up to their small house with Sakono and a few warriors in tow. Josephine would feed them, and they would talk about the state of the territory, about the treaties being negotiated and broken, about the future that was coming whether anyone wanted it or not. Aure trusted her as much as he trusted any white, which was to say not completely but enough to work together, and that fragile alliance became one of her most valuable assets as a cartographer. When surveyors or settlers came to her asking for maps of territories Aure had shown her as sacred, she refused, no matter how much money they offered. It cost her business and earned her enemies among some of the less scrupulous land speculators, but she had given her word, and her word meant something. Nathan supported her completely, never once suggesting she compromise her principles for profit. 2 years after their wedding, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, a missing monthly bleeding, a persistent tiredness, a tenderness in her breasts that would not go away. She waited to be sure before telling Nathan, spending a week in a daze of cautious joy and bone-deep terror. She had never thought much about children, had been too focused on her work to imagine herself as a mother, and now that it was happening, she felt utterly unprepared. She told Nathan on a Sunday morning while they were lying in bed watching the sunrise through their window. "I am going to have a baby," she said, the words strange in her mouth. Nathan went completely still. Then he rolled over to face her, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor." A smile spread across his face, slow and wondering. "A baby, we are going to have a baby." He laid his hand on her still flat stomach, his palm warm through her nightgown. "When? Late spring, I think, maybe early summer." Nathan pulled her close and she felt him trembling. "I am going to be a father," he said, as if testing the idea, "and you are going to be a mother." "I do not know how to be a mother," Josephine admitted. "I barely remember mine. What if I am terrible at it? You will be wonderful at it." "You are wonderful at everything you try." Nathan kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "We will figure it out together, just like everything else." The pregnancy was not easy. Josephine spent the first 3 months sick almost constantly, unable to keep down anything more complicated than dry toast and weak tea. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, and Nathan hovered over her like a nervous hen, trying to tempt her with every food he could think of. Finally, in her 4th month, the sickness eased and she began to eat again, to feel human again, and to watch in fascination as her body changed to accommodate the life growing inside her. She worked as long as she could, taking on local jobs that did not require long rides or camping in the field. Nathan tried to get her to stop entirely, but she refused, needing the work to feel like herself, to remember she was more than just an incubator for their child. They compromised, as they always did, finding a middle ground where she could work but not exhaust herself, where he could worry but not smother her. In April of 1881, Josephine went into labor 3 weeks earlier than expected. The pain started in the middle of the night, a tightening across her belly that woke her from uneasy sleep. She lay still for a while, timing them, trying to decide if this was real labor or just more of the false contractions that had been plaguing her for weeks. When her water broke, soaking the sheets and making Nathan bolt upright in alarm, she knew it was time. Mrs. Kowalski came to help, bringing with her the local midwife, a capable woman named Sarah Chen, who had delivered half the babies in Delta. Nathan was banished to the main room of their house, where he paced and worried while Josephine labored through the longest night of her life. The pain was unlike anything she had imagined, waves of it that crested and broke and crested again, each one harder than the last. She gripped Mrs. Kowalski's hand and pushed when Sarah told her to push, bore down with every ounce of strength she possessed, and felt her body tear and stretch to impossible dimensions. She screamed, not caring who heard, not caring about anything except getting this baby out, ending this torment. And then, as the first light of dawn touched the window, a baby's cry filled the room. Josephine collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted beyond measure, while Sarah lifted a squalling, red-faced infant into the air. "A boy," the midwife announced. "A big, healthy boy." Josephine started to cry, tears of relief and joy and residual pain streaming down her face. Sarah cleaned the baby quickly and placed him on Josephine's chest, and she looked down into her son's scrunched face and felt her heart crack open with love so fierce it was almost frightening. Nathan came in a moment later, his face pale with worry. "Joe, are you all right?" "I am fine. We are fine." She smiled up at him through her tears. "Come meet your son." Nathan approached the bed like a man in a dream, his eyes locked on the tiny bundle in Josephine's arms. He sat carefully on the edge of the mattress and reached out one finger to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. The infant grabbed onto Nathan's finger with surprising strength, and Nathan made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He is perfect," Nathan whispered. "You are perfect." "Thank you, Joe. Thank you for him." They named him James Thomas Vance after both their fathers, and he became the center of their universe. Josephine had worried she would not know how to be a mother, but it turned out that love was enough. Love and a willingness to learn, and Nathan's steady partnership in the endless work of caring for an infant. They took turns walking the floor with James when he would not sleep, took turns changing his diapers and soothing his cries, and discovered together the peculiar exhaustion and joy of new parenthood. Josephine's mapping work slowed but did not stop. She took James with her on local jobs, carrying him in a sling against her chest while she took measurements and drew sketches. Nathan worried, but she pointed out that she had been raised in survey camps and had turned out fine. Their son would learn the land the same way she had, through constant exposure and his parents' patient teaching. As James grew from infant to toddler, Josephine and Nathan's life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Nathan's cattle operation expanded, and he hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work. Josephine's reputation as a cartographer grew throughout the territory, and she received commissions from as far away as Denver. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Chief Auray died in 1880, and Josephine attended his funeral, one of the few whites invited to do so. She wept for him, for the battles he had fought and mostly lost, for the grace with which he had faced inevitable defeat. Sakono became the new chief, and their partnership continued, though the pressure on Ute lands only increased as more settlers poured into Colorado. In 1883, Josephine discovered she was pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and while the sickness was no more pleasant, she endured it with the confidence of experience. Nathan was delighted but even more protective than he had been the first time, clearly remembering how hard James's birth had been on her. "I survived it once, I will survive it again," she told him when he tried to wrap her in cotton wool. "You are carrying my child. I am allowed to worry." "You are allowed to worry quietly and from a reasonable distance." She softened the words with a kiss. "I love you for caring, Nathan, but you have to trust me to know my own limits." Their daughter was born in February of 1884, a few weeks late and twice as stubborn as her brother had been. The labor was shorter but more intense, and when Sarah Chen finally placed the screaming infant in Josephine's arms, she looked down at her daughter's furious red face and laughed. She is going to be trouble, Josephine predicted. She is going to be wonderful, Nathan corrected, already completely smitten. They named her Margaret Rose after Nathan's mother and no one in particular, because they both liked the sound of it. Maggie, as she quickly became known, was indeed trouble, with a stubborn streak that rivaled her mother's and a fearlessness that gave her parents gray hairs. Where James was cautious and thoughtful, Maggie threw herself into everything head first, and Josephine saw herself reflected in her daughter's determination. The years passed in a blur of work and family, of small triumphs and daily challenges. James started school and proved to have his mother's gift for mathematics. Maggie learned to ride almost before she could walk and followed Nathan around the ranch like a devoted shadow. Josephine continued her mapping work, though she turned down jobs that would take her away from home for more than a few days. Her maps were used by railroads and ranchers, by the government and private companies, and she took quiet pride in knowing that the territory was being developed with at least some input from someone who cared about accuracy and preservation. In 1887, the territorial government commissioned her to create a comprehensive map of western Colorado, a project that would take years and pay enough to secure their family's future. Josephine threw herself into the work, hiring assistants to help with measurements and sketches, organizing expeditions that sometimes took her away for weeks at a time. Nathan managed the ranch and the children during her absences, and when she returned home, exhausted and covered in trail dust, he would welcome her back with a kiss and a hot bath, and the news of everything she had missed. Their marriage was not perfect. They argued sometimes, over money or parenting or Josephine's tendency to take on too much work. Nathan's protectiveness occasionally crossed the line into control, and Josephine's independence sometimes looked like disregard for his legitimate concerns. But they had learned how to fight fair, how to listen even when they disagreed, how to apologize and forgive and move forward together. The love they had discovered in those early days in Delta had deepened into something more complex and durable, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. In 1890, Colorado became a state, and Josephine's comprehensive map was displayed in the new state capitol building in Denver. She and Nathan traveled to the city for the unveiling, bringing James and Maggie, who were now 9 and 6 respectively. The governor himself praised Josephine's work, calling it the finest cartographic achievement in the state's history, and she stood on the stage in the Capitol Rotunda and thought about how far she had come from that dusty meeting hall in Delta, where men had dismissed her work without even looking at it. Nathan stood in the audience with their children, his face shining with pride, and when her eyes met his across the crowded room, she felt the same pull of connection she had felt that first day when he looked at her maps and saw their value. They had built a life together these 12 years, had created work and family and a home that mattered. She had mapped territory no man had charted, and he had followed her lines straight to her heart, and together they had made something that would outlast them both. After the ceremony, they walked through Denver as a family, marveling at the electric lights and paved streets, at the evidence of civilization encroaching on what had so recently been wild frontier. Josephine felt a bittersweet pang, remembering the vast emptiness of the territory when she had first arrived, the sense of possibility that came from all that unmapped space. Progress was necessary, she knew, but something was lost in it too. You ever regret it? Nathan asked that evening when the children were asleep in their hotel room and they stood together on the balcony overlooking the city. Settling down, getting married, giving up the freedom to roam wherever you wanted. Josephine considered the question seriously because Nathan deserved her honesty. Sometimes I miss the solitude, the feeling of being the first person to see something and translate it into meaning, but I would not trade what we have for anything. You, the children, the life we built together, that matters more than any map I could ever draw. Good. Nathan pulled her close, and they stood together watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness. Because I plan to keep you for at least another 40 years. They returned to Delta the next day, to the small ranch that had grown comfortable over the years, to the horses and cattle and the big cottonwood tree they had planted the year James was born. Life resumed its familiar rhythm of work and family, seasons passing in their eternal cycle of planting and harvest, snow and thaw. Josephine continued mapping, though she took on fewer long-term projects as the children grew older and needed more of her attention. She taught James the mathematics of surveying, and he proved to have a natural aptitude for it, though he was more interested in engineering than cartography. Maggie had no patience for measurements, but could read the land in other ways, understanding instinctively where water would flow and where animals would shelter, knowledge that served her well when she started working cattle with Nathan. In 1895, Sakono died, and with him went the last of Josephine's direct connection to the Ute people. The tribe had been moved to a reservation, their territory reduced to a fraction of what our Ray had fought to preserve, and her careful notations of sacred sites had not been enough to prevent the inevitable. She grieved for that failure, even as she knew there was nothing more she could have done. The forces of Western expansion were too powerful, too relentless, and one woman's maps could not hold them back. But she had tried. That had to mean something. The new century arrived, bringing with it automobiles and airplanes and technologies Josephine could barely comprehend. The West was no longer wild, was barely even frontier anymore. The territory she had spent so many years mapping was now crisscrossed with roads and railways, dotted with towns and cities, thoroughly known and claimed and developed. Sometimes Josephine would look at her old maps and feel like she was staring at artifacts from another world, evidence of a time that had passed so quickly, it felt like a dream. But the love she and Nathan shared remained constant, a fixed point in a changing world. They grew older together, their bodies softening and slowing, but the partnership they had forged in youth only deepened with time. They became grandparents when James married and had children of his own, then again when Maggie did the same. And they welcomed the new generation with the same fierce love they had given their own children. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Nathan gave Josephine a gift, a leather-bound atlas of all the maps she had ever drawn, compiled and organized by their son, who had spent months gathering copies from archives and government offices. She turned the pages with trembling hands, seeing her life's work laid out in lines and measurements and careful notations, and she wept. "You changed the world, Joe," Nathan said, his own eyes bright with tears. "You gave shape to the unknown. That is no small thing. I could not have done it without you. You believed in me when no one else would. You gave me the courage to keep going." Nathan took her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that plagued his joints. "We did it together. Every map, every discovery, every mile traveled, we were partners. That is what I am most proud of. Not the work itself, but the fact that we did it side by side." They sat together on the porch of their house, the same house Nathan had built over 3 decades ago, and watched the sun set over the mountains. The land they had spent so long mapping stretched out before them, familiar and beloved, and Josephine felt a deep contentment settle into her bones. She had lived a life most women of her time could only dream of. She had worked alongside men as an equal, had been recognized for her skills and her contributions, had left a mark on the world that would long outlive her physical presence. But more than that, she had loved and been loved, had built a family and a home, had found in Nathan Vance a partner who saw her not as a woman who happened to do cartography, but as a cartographer who happened to be a woman, and who loved her all the more for it. In 1912, when Josephine was 57 years old, she received a letter from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. They were creating an exhibition on the mapping of the American West and wanted to include her work, calling her one of the most significant cartographers of her generation. The letter asked if she would be willing to travel to Washington for the opening. Josephine showed the letter to Nathan, who read it with a broad smile. "Of course you are going. We are going. This is the recognition you deserve." They made the trip that fall, traveling by train across the country Josephine had helped map. In Washington, she stood in the Smithsonian and looked at her maps displayed alongside those of famous explorers and military surveyors, her name given equal prominence, her contributions acknowledged. Young women approached her, asking how she had managed to break into such a male-dominated field, and she told them the truth, with stubbornness and skill, and a refusal to accept that her gender should limit her potential. Nathan stood beside her through it all, his hand at the small of her back, his pride evident in every smile. When reporters asked about the secret to her success, she gestured to him. "Partnership. I married a man who believed in me and supported my work, who never asked me to choose between my career and my family. That made all the difference." They stayed in Washington for a week, playing tourists, visiting monuments and museums, marveling at how much the country had changed since they were young. Then they returned to Delta, to Colorado, to the life they had built in the shadow of the mountains. Josephine continued working into her 60s, though she turned down all field work and focused instead on compiling and organizing the information she had gathered over decades. She wrote a manual on cartographic techniques that was used by surveyors across the West. She consulted on land disputes, using her intimate knowledge of the territory to help resolve boundary conflicts. And she trained the next generation of mapmakers, including two of her granddaughters, who showed the same aptitude for mathematics and spatial reasoning that had defined her own career. Nathan retired from active ranch work, turning over daily operations to their son-in-law while he and Josephine enjoyed a slower pace of life. They traveled sometimes, visiting their children and grandchildren scattered across Colorado and beyond. They took long walks through the countryside they had known so well, and Nathan would point out landmarks and Josephine would remember the first time she had measured and mapped them, the exhilaration of imposing order on chaos, of giving names to the nameless. In the spring of 1918, Nathan fell ill with pneumonia. He fought it for 2 weeks, his strong constitution battling the infection, but he was 62, and his body had been worn down by decades of hard work. Josephine sat by his bedside, holding his hand, willing him to recover the same way he had willed her through childbirth all those years ago. On a morning when apple blossoms were drifting past the window like snow, Nathan opened his eyes and looked at her with perfect clarity. "I have had a good life, Joe, a better life than I ever dreamed of, and it was all because of you. Do not talk like that. You are going to be fine." But her voice broke on the words because she could see in his eyes that he knew better. "Promise me something," Nathan said, his voice barely a whisper. "Promise me you will keep working, keep mapping, keep doing what you love. Do not let grief stop you, I promise." Tears streamed down Josephine's face, but she forced herself to smile. "But you are not going anywhere. We have at least another 20 years together." Nathan smiled back, that same smile that had captured her heart 39 years ago in a boarding house kitchen. I love you, Josephine Vance. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. I love you too, so much. He closed his eyes then, and his breathing became labored. And by sunset, he was gone. Josephine felt his absence like a physical wound, as if some essential part of her had been torn away. She had been whole with Nathan, had been her truest self, and without him the world felt diminished, drained of color. She went through the motions of the funeral, accepted condolences from what felt like the entire county, stood dry-eyed at the graveside while they lowered him into the earth. But inside she was screaming, raging against the unfairness of it, even though she knew death came for everyone eventually. The weeks after the funeral were the darkest of Josephine's life. She moved through her days in a haze of grief, unable to focus on work, barely able to eat. Her children worried, tried to draw her out, but she could not shake the weight of Nathan's absence. Everything reminded her of him. The empty space in their bed, the silence where his voice should be, the lack of his steady presence beside her. It was her granddaughter Emma, James's eldest child, who finally broke through the fog. Emma was 16, bright and ambitious, and she came to Josephine with a request. "Grandma, will you teach me cartography? Properly, I mean. I want to learn to do what you do." Josephine looked at the girl, saw the determination in her eyes, and felt something shift inside her. Nathan had made her promise to keep working, to not let grief stop her. She had given her word, and her word meant something. "Yes," Josephine said. "Yes, I will teach you." And so she did. Over the next months and years, Josephine poured her knowledge into Emma and the other young people who sought her out. She taught them the mathematics of surveying, the art of translating three-dimensional reality into two-dimensional representation, the importance of accuracy and detail. The work gave her purpose again, a reason to get out of bed in the morning, and slowly the grief became bearable, transformed from an open wound into an ache she carried with her always, but that no longer controlled her. She never stopped missing Nathan, never stopped wishing he was there to share new discoveries and small triumphs. But she learned to live with the absence, to find joy in her work and her family, to honor his memory by continuing to do what she loved. In 1925, when Josephine was 70, the state of Colorado commissioned a sculpture of her to be placed in the Capitol building, recognizing her contributions to the mapping and development of the state. She attended the unveiling in a wheelchair, her body finally failing after decades of hard use, and she looked at the bronze version of her younger self, holding a compass and a map, and felt a strange dissonance. That woman seemed like a stranger, someone from another lifetime, though Josephine could still remember the fierce determination and boundless energy of her youth. Emma had become a respected cartographer in her own right, working for the United States Geological Survey, and she gave a speech at the ceremony about her grandmother's legacy. Josephine listened with tears in her eyes, proud beyond measure of what her granddaughter had accomplished, of the doors she had helped open for the women who came after her. She lived another 3 years, long enough to see Emma promoted to head of the Western Survey Division, long enough to meet her first great-great-grandchild, long enough to finish organizing her personal papers for donation to the Colorado Historical Society. In the spring of 1928, she died in her sleep, peacefully, in the bed she had shared with Nathan for so many years. Her funeral was attended by hundreds. Government officials and ranchers, academics and cowboys, people whose lives she had touched in ways large and small. Her maps were displayed around the church, showing the scope of her work, the territory she had charted when no one believed a woman could do such a thing. Emma gave the eulogy, speaking of her grandmother's brilliance and stubbornness, her kindness and courage, the way she had blazed a trail for others to follow. They buried Josephine next to Nathan, in the small cemetery overlooking the valley they had loved. On her headstone was carved a simple compass rose, and beneath it the words, "She mapped the unknown." But those who had known her best knew that was only part of the story. Yes, she had mapped territory no man had charted, had given shape and meaning to the wild spaces of the West. But she had also found love in the most unexpected place, had built a partnership with a cowboy who followed her lines straight to her heart. And together, they had created a life richer and fuller than any map could capture. Their children and grandchildren continued their work, carrying forward the values Josephine and Nathan had lived by. James became a civil engineer, designing bridges and roads that connected the communities his mother had mapped. Maggie raised cattle and horses on the ranch her father had built, teaching her own children the value of hard work and respect for the land. The grandchildren became teachers and surveyors, doctors and artists, all of them carrying forward the legacy of curiosity and determination their grandparents had embodied. And in archives and historical societies, in government offices and university libraries, Josephine's maps remained, testament to a woman who refused to accept the limitations others tried to place on her, who saw the unknown and wanted to understand it, to translate it into something others could use and appreciate. Her work helped build a state, helped guide thousands of settlers and ranchers and travelers through difficult terrain, helped preserve at least some of the sacred places she had promised to protect. But more than that, her life proved that a woman could be both professional and maternal, both ambitious and loving, both fiercely independent and deeply committed to partnership. She had not had to choose between her work and her family, between her skills and her heart. She had claimed all of it, every piece of herself, and in doing so had lived a life that was entirely her own. The maps she drew were eventually replaced by more modern surveys, using technologies she could never have imagined. Satellites and GPS made her careful astronomical readings obsolete. But the principle remained the same: the desire to understand the land, to give order to chaos, to leave the world a little more known than you found it. And in Delta, Colorado, in the house Nathan built and where they had raised their children, Emma Vance lived with her own family, continuing the tradition of map-making and storytelling, ensuring that her grandmother's legacy would not be forgotten. She taught her children about Josephine and Nathan, about the love story that had started in a boarding house kitchen and lasted a lifetime, about the way two people from different worlds could find each other and build something beautiful together. On warm summer evenings, Emma would sit on the same porch where her grandparents had spent countless hours, and she would look out at the mountains and think about all the miles Josephine had traveled, all the territory she had mapped, all the barriers she had broken. And she would feel grateful to be part of that legacy, to carry forward the work her grandmother had started. The Wild West was gone, tamed and settled and thoroughly mapped. But the spirit of exploration Josephine had embodied lived on in every cartographer who sought to understand the unknown, in every woman who refused to let her gender limit her potential, in every partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love. She had mapped territory no man had charted, and in doing so had charted a course for future generations. The cowboy had followed her lines straight to her heart, and together they had created something that would endure long after the physical maps had faded and crumbled. A story of love and work, of partnership and determination, of two people who found each other in the vastness of the West and decided to build a life together. And that, in the end, was the most accurate map of all. The map of two hearts finding their way to each other, navigating the uncertain terrain of love and commitment, and arriving together at something that felt like home.